Welcome back to Michael Horner and Kirk Durston talking about the track record of religion throughout history. And Michael has been leading us through a fascinating historical review of that's in response to a popular myth today. And the size of that myth is actually quite profound between what our culture today believes about religious violence. We're specializing or particularly in pertaining to Christianity, and the actual track record of history. There is a significant difference, and Michael has been really helping us work through all that. So, Michael, I'm looking forward to your episode today. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm
Excellent.
looking forward to this discussion today.
Yeah, I've not had the opportunity to do the kind of research that you have in this area, and it's just like a course I'm taking, just being your co-host here and listening to what you're saying. So, yeah, take it away, Michael. What have you got to say to us here today?
Well, the last episode, we kind of finished off looking at how do irreligious or non-religious belief systems do with respect to violence compared to religious views, and in particular Christian views. And what I think we're able to show is that they don't fare any better. And in fact, there's really good evidence that they fare far worse, especially when you look at the 20th century uh, results of violence and death under worldviews that do not contain God,
Yeah,
where that belief is absent.
yeah. As a core belief, atheism was actually a core belief of some of those cultures,
Right.
and taught in the schools, basically required if you want any
Required.
sort
Yeah.
of career advancement. So it was not just a benign belief that there is no God, but it was a core central belief.
Right. And my broader hypothesis um, is that the idea that Christianity is harmful, which would be another way or a close way of also saying that Christianity is violent, or that would be one way of being harmful. That's one of my core hypotheses. And William Cavanaugh, who's a scholar who has really focused in on the topic of religious violence, has become an expert on that. He basically confirms that part of my hypothesis in his book called The Myth of Religious Violence. And he basically concludes that the idea that religions basically promote violence, that's just part of who they are. He calls that a myth. So he's using myth in the same sense of the word that I use it. Not only is it false, but it's also an extremely influential um, belief or view that not only affects cultures, but actually um, it even controls the way cultures think, provides a framework beyond which it's difficult to get out of uh,
Hmm.
when you're thinking. And so I found his book, The Myth of Religious Violence, very, very interesting and helpful. And so I thought it would be worthwhile spending some time looking at what he has claimed. And I can't spend enough time to give all the arguments that are contained within a significant book, but I think we'll see some of the arguments and his key conclusions anyway, and which will show that he's confirming my view that this idea that Christianity is violent. I mean, let alone other religions, we're leaving that aside right now, but that Christianity is violent and harmful is a myth, which is not to say that Christians don't do harmful things or violent things. But it is to say that Christianity itself and the teachings of Christianity is not, it's a myth that it is itself the cause of violence in any way much different than anyone else or any other view, because we always have to ask the question, compared to what? And Cavanaugh does that in his own way. So with that intro, let me start off with what Cavanaugh says is his hypothesis. He says, my hypothesis is that, this is his hypothesis as opposed to Michael Horner's hypothesis. Cavanaugh says, my hypothesis is that religion and violence arguments, so that's a class of arguments he calls religion and violence arguments, serve a particular need for their consumers in the West. These arguments, he says, are part of a broader Enlightenment narrative, that's also part of my thinking, that has invented a dichotomy between the religious and the secular, and constructed the former as an irrational and dangerous impulse that must give way in public to rational secular forms of power. In the West, he says, revulsion toward killing and dying in the name of one's religion is one of the principal means by which we become convinced that killing and dying in the name of the nation state is laudable and proper. And the myth of religious violence also provides secular social orders with a stock character, the religious fanatic, to serve as enemy. So that gives you an idea where Cavanaugh is headed, and we won't spend an equal amount of time with all the conclusions there. But the first part, that the Enlightenment narrative has invented a dichotomy between the religious and the secular, and it shows the religious as being irrational and dangerous, and that the secular, or the rational secular forms of power must keep that in check. That is the part of his thinking that we're going to focus on here. So Cavanaugh says, I have no doubt that ideologies and practices of all kinds, including, for example, Islam and Christianity, can and do promote violence. So he's not denying that. Under certain conditions, they can and do promote violence, he says. But what I challenge as incoherent, he says, is the argument that there is something called religion, that is a genus of which Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and so on are species, which is necessarily more inclined to violence than are ideologies and institutions that are identified as secular. Unlike other books on religion and violence, I do not argue that religion either does or does not promote violence, but rather I analyze the political conditions under which the very category of religion is constructed. So he's not denying that religion's thinking can and has promoted violence, but he wants to challenge the idea that it's more than violence that would be promoted under irreligious or non-religious views, and he wants more the focus to be on what are the conditions, what are the political conditions that would lead violence to come from any belief system or ideology, including religion and irreligion. So he adds, this book then is not a defense of religion against the charge of violence. And here I think now he's going to talk about people like you and I who have been talking about this. He says people who identify themselves as religious sometimes argue that the real motivation behind so-called religious violence is in fact economic and political and not religious. Others argue that people who do violence are by definition not religious. That is, the crusader is not really a Christian, for example, because he does not really understand the meaning of Christianity. And so Cavanaugh says, I do not think that either of these arguments works. In the first place, it's impossible to separate religious from economic and political motives in such a way that religious motives are innocent of violence. And in the second place, it may be the case that the Crusader, as an example, has misappropriated the true message of Christ, but one cannot therefore excuse Christianity of all responsibility. Christianity is not simply a set of doctrines, he says, immune to historical circumstance, but a lived historical experience embodied and shaped by the empirically observable actions of Christians. Now, I think this does include the type of thinking that we've been talking about in the last couple of episodes. I mean, we have mentioned repeatedly that just because a Christian has been involved in doing something that is wrong, morally wrong, or harmful to others or harmful to human flourishing, does not necessarily mean that Christianity, the teachings of Christianity, the teachings of Jesus and his apostles, are harmful. And so I think he does have people like us in mind, who are sort of trying to defend religion from uh, claims that we are violent or harmful.
Well,
Um, so
if I
yeah,
could,
I think we need to respond to Cavanaugh a little bit here, and I sense that you have some thoughts on this as well.
yeah, no, I mean, I understand his point, but what I'm uneasy about is that he's using the word Christianity um, without really defining what that is, or perhaps conflating the teachings of Christianity with the teachings of Christ. And the teachings of Christ, what we would see is the core beliefs of authentic Christianity, but we all know that different denominations and the three major categories of the Christian church, the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Protestant, they all have their own additional, shall we say, teachings or interpretations. So I think, like, I understand what he's saying here, but I'm wondering if he isn't failing at a little bit to acknowledge that there is a spectrum. It's more of a spectrum between the teachings of Christ, and then as you move away from that, you also have the teachings of Christianity, but also he says something about it's difficult. He says it's a lived historical experience. And before that, it's not simply a set of doctrines immune to historical circumstances. No, that's an interesting phrase, historical circumstances, because we have talked about culture, and culture is really the actualization of the historical circumstances at that moment, or in that particular year or decade or whatever. And we've already acknowledged that Christianity, and I'm distinguishing between Christianity in the whole spectrum of different traditions and teachings that includes. We have acknowledged already that it is not immune to, as he puts it, historical circumstances, as we've put it, culture. But what about the teachings of Christ? And I think that's really what we have been trying to say. We're not trying to defend Christianity in its general sense,
Right.
but we're asking people to reconsider what Jesus actually said, what the teachings of Jesus were. And at that point, that it really does become kind of incompatible with some of the things that Christianity in the larger sense has done. And we're not going to defend that. I mean, we've acknowledged that, but that's one of my initial thoughts, is that I'm uncomfortable with the way he just simply talks about Christianity without really distinguishing that from the teachings of Christ. Now, it's
Yeah.
not a distinct entity, but more the teachings of Christ are a subset of what we might call Christianity writ large.
Right. And it's understandable. And we do have to kind of work hard at making a distinction there. And and one way that this distinction has been made and is made by the scholarly world is calling the lived historical experience embodied and shaped by the empirically observable actions of Christians, to use Cavanaugh's phrase, as Christendom, in contrast to Christianity. And actually, the word Christianity there, it is ambiguous. Are we just talking about the teachings of Christ, or are we talking about the actions of all Christians, since then? And that ambiguity is understandable. But the point that we're trying to make is that Christendom may have has failed to certain degrees.
Mm-hmm.
But the teachings of Jesus are not the culprit. That's the only point we want to make.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a feeling that Cavanaugh wouldn't have any problem with that because of other things that he says.
Yeah.
He says, I have no intention of excusing Christianity or Islam or any other set of ideas and practices from careful analysis. Given certain conditions, Christianity and Islam can and do contribute to violence. And we would agree with that. Given certain conditions, that can happen. But that's not enough to justify the conclusion that the teachings of Jesus are harmful to human flourishing, which is the point that we want to make.
And I think not only does secular culture fail to make sometimes a distinction or critically examine what Christianity does compared to what the teachings of Jesus were, but I think even within Christianity itself, in my particular, whatever denomination you're in, those people could seem to see themselves, they would call themselves Christians. And I'm cautious about using that term nowadays, simply because I know that how I might use the word Christian and how culture in general understands the word Christian, those are not perfectly compatible. And so even Christians, they would be guilty of some of the things that I think Cavanaugh is pointing out here. They would say, well, true Christianity would never do those things or whatever. But the Christian saying that hasn't really thought through the distinction or the distinction between the teachings of Christ and what Christianity in general or Christendom has done.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Cavanaugh pushes this thing a little bit more now, and this is more into the area where I think he's confirming my hypothesis that there's a myth that Christianity is harmful. He says, but what is implied in the conventional wisdom, and by conventional wisdom, he's talking about this idea that religion is violent, is that there's an essential difference between religions such as Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Judaism on the one hand, and secular ideologies and institutions such as nationalism, Marxism, capitalism, and liberalism on the other hand. And the former are essentially more prone to violence. That's part of the conventional wisdom now. More absolutist, more divisive, and irrational than the latter, than the secular. It is this claim, he says, that I find both unsustainable and dangerous. It is unsustainable because ideologies and institutions labeled secular can be just as absolutist, divisive, and irrational as those labeled religious. And it's dangerous because it helps to marginalize and even legitimate violence against those forms of life that are labeled religious. What gets labeled religious and what does not is therefore of crucial importance. And he goes on to say that coercion is used to get people to adopt this dichotomy. So this definitely is fitting into what we've talked about so far. That when you say Christianity is harmful, compared to what? and Cavanaugh is saying, look, if you look at Marxism and nationalism, capitalism, liberalism, any secularism, you can find the same sort of violence as as well. And so, I mean, actually, that this ultimately points to a future episode where we're going to say, okay, if we can't blame Christianity, or if we can't blame Marxism alone or Christianity alone, or then what is to blame? And it's going to come down to the human nature, the heart of man and women. So
Could I go so far as to say, maybe this is being a bit bold, but instead of talking about whether to blame, say, Christianity for being violent or blame secular society for being violent, we could actually say, who should we thank of those two groups? And I realize right away we're maybe creating a false dichotomy here, but just for the sake of getting the point across, who should we thank for actually reducing human nature's propensity for violence? Let's look at some of these secular governments where atheism was the core belief. Let's look at Christianity, just Christianity, and see which group seems to have the more positive effect at reducing the violent tendencies of human nature. And I think there, if we looked at who should we thank, in the past episodes at least, we would be thanking at least the teachings of Jesus at the very least, I think. Right. We wouldn't be thanking atheism or atheistic societies or cultures or governments.
Well, you're highlighting the exact issue, the dichotomy, the exact myth that I'm attacking and trying to set the record straight about. Because if you ask the average person, who should we thank for Western culture being the way it is, a lot of people would not point to Christianity as being the main reason, but they would point to secularism. It's secularism that was the hero here. It finally put religion in its proper place and removed it from the public square, and in doing so, stopped the violence that was taking place. And in the 30 Years' War, for example, was one of the major things that people point to. Now, Cavanaugh deals with all of that in his book, and he says there's a great deal of myth making going on in that process. So we've tried to set the record straight on that. And so as we continue looking at Cavanaugh here, we're going to see how his input is going to speak directly to that question: who should we thank? And it's not clear that we should be thanking secularism. He's going to go so far as to say that they're actually the cause of much of the violence, and not necessarily religion. So that's why I found this so interesting, and I think is so helpful if our culture is going to get things right, is going to set the record straight on who should we thank. I love the way you put that. I'm going to adopt that now. That's the question we need to be asking: who should we be thanking for the good that we do have in the West? And again, not saying that the Western culture is perfect. I mean, far, far from it. But compared to the rest of history, it's a remarkable advancement. And other people who are alive today know that, and that's why they want to move to the West.
Even talking about Western culture, I think that it actually peaked a few decades ago, or a decade or two ago. So when we're talking about Western culture, we need to think what time period are we talking about? Yeah. Like Western culture right now, there seems to be a lot of maybe consensus is a little too strong, but that it's in decline. Even my ethics professor at the University of Manitoba, who was an atheist, wrote an article about the decline of morality or ethics in Western culture. It's not just here in North America. He believed it's a global decline now. Wherever you have Western culture, there is a serious ethical decline in place. But in the past, it did peak. And I think the question is, well, what were the driving influences in helping Western culture go so far and peak so high before this decline began? And that's where I think the Judeo-Christian principles really were instrumental in helping Western culture reach a particular peak before the decline began. And if anything, the decline is walking lockstep with an increase in secularism. So secularism is increasingly influential in Western culture over the last, say, 25 to 30 years. Now, correlation doesn't mean causation, so let me just say that. But it is interesting to note that with the decline of the influence of, say, Christianity and the rise of the influence of secularism, we're also seeing a decline in the flourishing and the ethics of Western culture.
I would agree with that. And Cavanaugh is making the point that this religious violence myth is a core part of the Enlightenment thinking. So this has been around for 250 years, having its effect and its impact. And I mean, the full effect maybe is still yet to come. And if we are in a decline right now, maybe a case can be made that it, as you say, it is the secularism part of Western culture that may be more the culprit than it is the religious part. Cavanaugh.
It would be.
Go ahead.
It would be hard to blame the current decline on Christianity when Christianity, at least here in Canada for sure, has so little influence anymore that it would be very difficult to pin the decline, let's say, in our culture here in Canada on Christian teachings because it's very little influence. It's at least in the government and public life.
Yeah. So Cavanaugh titles his book, The Myth of Religious Violence. And here's what he says about his use of the word myth. He says, I use the term myth to describe this claim, not merely to indicate that it's false, but to give a sense of the power of the claim in Western societies. A story takes on the status of myth when it becomes unquestioned. It becomes very difficult to think outside the paradigm that the myth establishes and reflects, because myth and reality become mutually reinforcing. This when I read this, I thought this is what's going on with this idea that religion is violent. And in the West, when people say that, they're thinking Christianity first and foremost. That Christianity is violent, harmful, and I see that popping up in discussions. When you push people, you push them back, and they often come back to that. Well, we all know that, religion is harmful, religion is violent. Like, I just see it over and over again. And so when he talked about myth functioning this way, I just see that the idea that Christianity is harmful or violent. So society, he says, is structured to conform to the apparent truths that the myth reveals, and what is taken as real increasingly takes on the color of the myth. And the more that some are marginalized as other, the more other they become. So those who don't accept that myth are marginalized as other, and more so. As at the same time, the myth itself becomes more unquestioned, the more social reality is made to conform to it. Society is structured in such a way as to make the categories through which the myth operates seem given and inevitable. To add to this, I think this is worth going to. He says, all of this makes the refutation of a myth particularly difficult. He says Linda Zarelli's comments about what she calls a mythology apply here. And this is a quote from Linda Zarelli. A mythology cannot be defeated in the sense that one wins over one's opponent through the rigor of logic or the force of evidence. A mythology cannot be defeated through arguments that would reveal it as groundless belief. A mythology is utterly groundless, hence stable. That's an interesting statement. Groundless, hence stable. What characterizes a mythology is not so much its crude or naive character. Mythologies can be extremely complex and sophisticated, but rather its capacity to elude our practices of verification and refutation. So she seems to be saying that it's the groundlessness of the myth that makes it stable and impenetrable, impervious to attack by reason and rationality, which is an interesting thought. And I can't help but think of postmodernism and much of current critical theory in that really fits that. But that's another whole topic here.
Well,
We're
you and me
only on secularism right now, which that would be an offshoot of that goes even far afield.
Well, you and I are both familiar with philosophy. We both have graduate degrees in philosophy, and we're used to, let's say, if someone presents an argument, we're used to looking at the premises within that argument to see if they're good or they're false or true. And so if we disagree with an argument, we see there's a problem, we usually look at the premises. But what she's saying here is really, and this kind of myth that we're dealing with, there are no premises. There is no argument in favor. It's not a rationally grounded belief or feeling, and it's way more difficult. There's no premises to attack.
You can't pin
there's
it
no
down.
Premises to question.
Right.
It's like trying to nail jello to the wall or score a goal when the goalposts are moving.
Yeah.
And it's more of a feeling. It's a belief that is much more difficult sometimes to get people to question, because people will often be more committed to what they feel than what you can rationally show them.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that in mind, then let's talk a little bit. Or Cavanaugh talks about how he proceeded in his reasoning. He says, I examine arguments from 9 of the most prominent academic proponents of this idea that religion is peculiarly prone to violence. The examples range widely across different scholarly disciplines and give different types of explanations for why religion is prone to violence. Like religion is absolutist, religion is divisive, religion is irrational. Those are the 3 main ones he ends up focusing on. But they all suffer from the same defect: the inability to find a convincing way to separate religious violence from secular violence. Now we're getting to the core of his argument here. Each of the arguments I examine is beset by internal contradictions. Most assume a substantivist concept of religion, whereby religion can be separated from secular phenomena based on the nature of religious beliefs, but I show how such distinctions break down in the course of each author's own analysis. One of the authors discussed seeing the contradictions involved in substantivist concepts of religion, employs a more functionalist concept of religion, and openly expands the definition of religion then to include ideologies and practices that are usually called secular, such as nationalism and consumerism. But as a result, however, the term religion comes to cover virtually anything humans do that give their lives order and meaning. And in that scholar's work, the term religion is so broad it serves no useful analytical purpose. So this is the first issue that he deals with, is this distinction between religion and secular just isn't as clear as it seems to be. And the reason it seems to be so clear for us is because that's the air we breathe. That's the water we're swimming in, that we've been indoctrinated with the last 250 years, that there is a clear distinction between religion and secular, and religion is prone to violence and secularism is not. that is the myth that we all have grown up with, and it's very difficult to even think outside of it. So it takes some work to kind of challenge it. And so then he goes on and says, I argue that so-called secular ideologies and institutions like nationalism and liberalism can be just as absolutist, divisive, and irrational as those called religious. People kill for all sorts of things. In fact, this is an interesting part of his analysis is the what's the word I'm looking for here? The right to kill is an issue that he deals with, and sort of to kill in the name of religion was a part of the way things used to be, and so the way the myth of religious violence goes, secularism had to come in and fix that problem and control this irrational and bloody move or desire to kill that is part of the religious thing. But he points out, Cavanaugh points out that people kill for all sorts of things. And the real question we have to ask is, under what conditions do certain beliefs and practices, any belief and practice, turn violent? And he lists things like, under what conditions do beliefs like jihad or the invisible hand of the market? And then he adds one which caught my attention, the sacrificial atonement of Christ, or the role of the United States as a worldwide liberator. Under what conditions do certain beliefs like that turn violent? And I think he's right that that's where the focus of attention should be. What are the conditions that turn certain beliefs violent? And not just a priori assume that just because a belief is religious, that is a sufficient explanation for the violence, because religion is essentially violent. And so he says the point is not simply that secular violence should be given equal attention to religious violence. The point is that the very distinction between secular and religious violence is unhelpful, misleading, and mystifying. So you can see he's really taking aim at the root of the myth that I find hard to actually, give up on, even though I'm a religious person who I don't believe that religion is inherently violent. And yet I've still been indoctrinated my whole lifetime with this view. And it takes some work to kind of be willing to say, okay, maybe it isn't true that religions are more violent than, non-religious groups.
Well, there's a basic principle of human psychology that, for example, the communists in Russia, when I was reading an account of prisoners where they would try and reprogram their thinking, and that simply one of the basic things is you just have to repeat something over and over again, often enough, in different ways at different times, with no argument whatsoever. And people will start to believe or to grasp or to hold that thing, whatever it may be, if they hear it often enough, repeated often enough, and especially from various sources. And that's exactly what's happening here over the last, I guess since the Enlightenment, really, is this repeated assertion with a little bit of facts mingled in, and it works even better if you can mix some truth in with it, that religion, and really when we're talking about the Enlightenment and Western culture, it's really pinpointing or focusing on Christianity. That's really what has been at the brunt of the attack, I think, up until maybe recent, and then people started questioning Islam, given some of the great events in the last, say, 30 years. And when you've heard something often repeated, it is hard to, even for me, like there's stuff I hear all the time on the news, and I know it's not true because I can see peer-reviewed papers that say, well, actually this or that. And yet at the same time, I don't even want to say anything about it, because I know the moment I open my mouth, I will be discredited simply because everybody knows whatever is true. And this is one of them, this myth of religious violence.
So that's what we're dealing with here. And as I said, I found Cavanaugh's work helpful. So let's go right to examples of religious violence. And he says he examines the example of the wars of religion of the 16th and 17th century in Europe. He says the story of these wars serves as kind of a creation myth for the modern state. So that's interesting phraseology. The modern state having its own creation myth. I mean, we talk about religions having a creation myth, right? But he's applying that to the modern state. The modern secular state has kind of a creation myth itself. And according to this myth, Protestants and Catholics began killing each other over doctrinal differences, thus showing the intractability and inherent violence of religious disagreements. And the modern state was born as a peacemaker in this process, relegating religion to private life only as opposed to public, and uniting people of various religions around loyalty to the sovereign state. Now, this is interesting. I mean, as I began reading this, I began to see more and more of what I've heard from people who would label themselves as secular humanists. You know, the secular humanist societies and associations and organizations. And I realized, no, this is the stuff that their whole thinking is built upon, and this idea of the inherent violence of religion is part of that. So Cavanaugh responds to this. He says Christians certainly did kill each other, marking a signal failure of Christians to resist violence. So he admits that, just like we have admitted that Christians have committed violent acts as well. But the transfer of power from the church to the state was not simply a remedy for the violence. So I have to fill in a few gaps here because we can't read the entire book on air, but there was this process of transfer of power that used to reside in the church, and in the medieval times, you know, moving to the early modern and modern times, it got transferred to the state. And the myth that we're told is that was done as a remedy for the violence. And Cavanaugh saying, well, no, it's not all that's going on here. In fact, he says the transfer of power from the church to the state predated the division of Christendom into Catholics and Protestants. So that transfer from of power and actually the power to kill in the name of the religion that existed in the medieval times and earlier, it's taken centuries for that power to be transferred slowly and gradually to the state. And in many ways, here's this key point: this transfer of power itself was a cause of the violence of the so-called wars of religion. So you have Catholics and Protestants fighting each other. Well, the transfer of power from the church to the state, Cavanaugh says, was a cause of this killing, of this violence. The shift from medieval to modern, from church power to state power, was a long, complex process with gains and losses. Whatever it was not a simple, progressive march from violence to peace. The gradual transfer of loyalty from international church to national state was not the end of violence in Europe, but a migration of the holy. That's the phrase he uses: migration of the holy from church to state, in the establishment of the ideal of dying and killing for one's country. So I think what he means by the migration of the holy is that towards which we give our allegiance to. And that moved that from giving our allegiance to the church or to God to giving our allegiance to the state. And along with that allegiance comes with it the right and even maybe the duty to kill in the name of, which was the way people thought in ancient and medieval times, that it was right, and even sometimes a duty to kill in the name of their culture and their religion. And now it's become transferred to that has been transferred to the state. I do need to push on here a bit, I think, to complete a point. So historians generally, no, let me skip down to this. There was simply no divide between religious and social or political causes. Now, speaking of the religious wars, now 16th to 17th century, there's no way to pinpoint something called religion as the cause of these wars and excise it from the exercise of public power. The standard narrative says that the modern state identified religion as the root of the problem and separated it from politics. However, there was no separation of religion and politics. What we see in reality is what John Bossy describes as a migration of the holy from the church to the state. Ostensibly, the holy was separated from politics for the sake of peace, but in reality, the emerging state appropriated the holy to become itself a new kind of religion. So he says, I show the implausibility of the idea that the transfer of power from church to the state was the solution to the wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. The process of state building begun well before the Reformation, and it was inherently conflictual. And the point is that the transfer of power from the church to the state was not the solution to the violence of the 16th and 17th centuries, but it was a cause of those wars. And so there's ample historical evidence to cast doubt on the idea that the rise of the modern state saved Europe from the violence of religion. The rise of the modern state did not usher in a more peaceful Europe, but the rise of the state did accompany a shift in what people were willing to kill and die for. The Latin phrase that's translated, it is sweet and proper to die for one's country, would take on a normative status in the early 20th century. And he says, I argue that the legend of the wars of religion is not simply objective history, but itself an ideological accompaniment to shifts in Western configuration of power, especially the transfer of lethal loyalty to the emergent state. Now, I know that was a lot, but that's the core of what he's getting at here. So that the creation of the secular state was not the solution to the wars of religion and did not create peace, but it actually was a cause to those wars, because it was just the shift of allegiance to this emergent state, and it now had this allegiance which contained the right and maybe the duty to kill in the name of, that used to be aligned more with the culture and the religion that was in that culture. So I find that persuasive and extremely interesting in light of how powerful this myth is, that no, religion is just inherently and essentially violent, and it must be marginalized at the least, kept out of the public square, or maybe even eliminated in the more extreme examples.
Well, I hardly know what to say, Michael. It is kind of disturbing, because the implication here is that if the positive influence of religion, or specifically Christianity, cannot be restored, it does not bode well for the future of a secular culture. And if it is in current decline right now, it's not hard to see what could happen in the future as far as its secularism's failure to restrain what human nature is capable of.
Yeah. Yeah. How are we doing for time? We probably need to cut this off at this point and pick it up again next episode, I think.
Well, it's fascinating, Michael. Thank you very much for walking us through this kind of a quote summary of William Cavanaugh's work. It's a lot of stuff here to think about. So appreciate that and thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we'll pick it up next time.
Yeah. Bye for now.